Hi everyone, it's Lauren. I hope you're all doing really well and you are as excited as I am to be talking about my top 10 favourite reads from 2019. I've also done videos on my most surprising reads, my most disappointing reads and the worst books that I read last year, so I'll link those videos in the description box below if you're interested. But we are ending on a very happy note and I have 10 fantastic books to recommend to you today. I will link them in the description box as well if you're interested in checking them out. Before I get into the books though, I have started a Patreon page this year, which I thought would be fun to create a little community. So I'm sure everybody is well aware of what Patreon is by now, but if you're not, it's a site where you can tip your favourite creators just to say thank you for all the content they're creating. If you don't want to join, that's absolutely fine, and all of my videos and everything on YouTube will continue as they are and remain free and available for everybody to access. But if you are interested, it'd be fantastic to have you, and there is also a tier in there for a quarterly book club if you're interested in joining a book club run by me and books chosen by you. And there is going to be an extra secret Patreons only video going up every month for people in that tier. So if you are interested at all, the link is in the description box below. So let's get on to the books. These are not in any preferential order. These are just the order that I've thought of them. I don't think they're even in the order that I read. But the first book that I would highly recommend is Natives by Akala. I listened to this on audiobook and this is read by Akala himself, so I think that gave it a kind of an extra edge for me. This is part autobiography of him growing up as part of a mixed race family in London and part look at Britain's relationship in general with race and colonialism. It's really well argued, really well researched, and it covers so many different topics, like for example his grandparents being of Jamaican descent, and he talks about the difference between communities of Afro-Caribbean descent and like West African descent. He talks about the problems of knife crime and why the police in Britain tend to pin this as a black young youth problem rather than just young people in general in poor areas. He talks about the lack of education he got in mainstream school about Britain's role in slavery and colonialism in general, and compares it to what he learnt in his Saturday school, and really tries to dissect why Britain has such an uncomfortable relationship with racism and why we think we don't have a racism issue when it is there, because we haven't really confronted our role in racism and slavery around the world, and we find it really hard to kind of look at ourselves and acknowledge that there's a problem there. So I would highly recommend this, especially if you're from Britain. It's a really, really interesting and really comprehensive read. Next on my list is another non-fiction that I listened to on audiobook, and that is The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. And this book looks at the lives of the 5 generally held official victims of Jack the Ripper, and she really strips back the idea that they were prostitutes, because many of the, like 3 out of 5 of them, there's no proof that they were at all. But also she takes away this idea of Jack the Ripper as this glamorous villain, and she doesn't look at the murders or the gore or the violence at all. She kind of uncovers the real women and their real lives underneath all of this, which is a fantastic bit of research that she's done. It's so amazing how much information she's managed to uncover and how much information really is there that we've all for years just ignored, because the idea of Jack the Ripper is the idea that's so beguiling and so intriguing. There's so many people that are interested in him as a murderer rather than the actual women that he murdered. And it was just amazing how she takes you on a journey through all of these women's lives, how they ended up on the street, how so many of them were victims of alcoholism and wider problems in Victorian society. There were a lot of rough sleepers at that time, and she really helps you kind of inhabit what it would have been like for those people living in Whitechapel and understanding that there was a murderer about, but not having anywhere else to sleep other than on the street. And it's just amazing. I couldn't recommend this more. I don't read a lot of historical non-fiction, but I feel like this book really, you just really feel like you're part of it. She gives such great context for what was happening in society at that time in London, and even though you know the fate of these women, you just, so many times you're thinking, oh please just make this work, please just take this job, please just stay with your family, whatever. You're really, really rooting for them to make the right choices and somehow survive, and I just think it's so skillfully put together. Number 3 is a book I haven't really been able to shut up about this year, and that is Lani by Max Porter. This book is quite an acquired taste, I would say, because it's a bit of a mix between poetry and prose, but I absolutely loved it. I thought it was wonderful. This is a story of a young boy called Lani who lives in a village just on the commuter belt outside of London. We get perspectives from Lani's mum, Lani's dad, an older man called Pete who's an artist who lives in the village, and also this strange abstract being being called Dead Papa Toothwort, which is this manifestation of a green man or a manifestation of humanity throughout the centuries, and he's listening to people and watching Lani and seeing what's happening, and he's really part of nature and the seasons. And through this setup we get a tale which is looking at the idea of connecting with people, the idea of art, the love of nature and seasons, and also just the eccentricities of the great British public, essentially, because Dead Papa Toothwort is overhearing snippets of these silly conversations which are happening around the village. And it manages to marry sort of the bigger emotions, because Lani goes missing and you really see what's happening with his mother and father and how it affects the village around him. And it marries that with these kind of small everyday things like, oh, there's not enough butter on my scone or whatever. And the language and the poetry I felt was just so sumptuous and layered, and it's just really evocative of all of the sights and smells of the countryside, along with all the emotions of family and the people in the village. So I thought this was a fantastic read. Number 4 is Cersei by Madeline Miller, which has been everywhere. I know a lot of people have talked about it a lot, but I just really enjoyed it. This is a reimagining of the life of Cersei, who is a witch who appears on an island as part of the Odyssey, when Odysseus and his men land on her island and she turns all his men to pigs. But this is taking her story right from her birth. She's a nymph, she's a daughter of the sun god, and it gives her entire tale, but not just her tale of her brothers and sisters. And I really loved that as part of this book you got a weaving together of lots of different Greek myths which are sort of happening concurrently, and also the way she handles the concept of immortality and the concept of the gods was really interesting to me, because if you're a god and you're going to live forever, you just have no concept of consequences and you don't care about what's going on. You'll just do whatever you want and you'll play with the mortals, and it doesn't really affect you. And Cersei's got that strange hybrid situation where she's not a god and she's not got very much power, but she is immortal and she has a lot of dealings and interactions with mortal people. So I thought that was a really interesting take on it, and I just enjoyed it. I just enjoyed hearing about her story. I don't have too much to say other than it was just a fun book to read. Number 5 was another fantastic book that I read at the beginning of this year, which was Spring by Ali Smith. The more I'm going through this list, the more excited I'm getting, because I just love all of these books, and it's just making me smile remembering when I read them. Spring is part of Ali Smith's seasonal quartet. It's the 3rd book in her quartet, and although I can tell you some of the plot of this book, it's not really about plot. Each book is being written as a sort of answer to the year within which it was written. So autumn really focused on the Brexit situation. Winter, among other things, was focused on the environment, and spring is again looking at multiple things. Like, one of our characters is a woman who works in a detention centre for people who are being told they're illegal immigrants and are about to be sent home. There's also a man whose friend has died, a very old friend of his who was a writer, and they discuss lots of different things, and he's coping with this loss of her. But it's also somehow really looking at the concept of misinformation, of fake news. In typical Ali Smith style, she's so clever with the words and the sentences and the way she constructs it. And there's a little girl who somehow seems to know much more than all the adults around her and feels almost magic. There's a little bit of magical realism, I feel, happening in this book as well, as there tends to be in a lot of Ali Smith's work. And I just think it's astounding what she's doing. I cannot wait for summer. I feel like if I have time, I would like to reread Autumn, Winter and Spring before summer comes out, but realistically, am I going to have time to do that? I don't know. But the stories themselves don't follow on from each other, but because they feel like they're about the evolution of our society right now, it is good to read them in order, I think, if you can. Number 6 is quite a recent read, and that is Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. Again, this is a book which has been around a lot. Lots of people have been raving about, and I did have high hopes. I wanted to enjoy it, but I didn't necessarily think it was going to be on my list of favourites for the whole year, and yet here it is. This is about a woman called Queenie who is basically going through a really difficult time in her life. She's just broken up with a boyfriend she's been with a couple of years, and she doesn't really know why. And she's struggling with that. She's struggling at work. She's dating lots of very questionable men. And she has a difficult relationship with her mother and lives with her grandparents. And it's been marketed a little bit as the Black Bridget Jones, which I think I understand why people market it that way, because she is kind of like a single woman working in I think she works for a magazine. But really, like, Queenie herself is nothing like Bridget Jones, and she's got such a full character, and she's a flawed character, but you really understand her. Her relationships with her friends are so well formed and so funny as well when you see their group texts, and you understand why she has each of them in her life for different reasons. I liked that she had trauma in her past with her parents, but that wasn't something which was hanging over the book. It's something that's true for her. So it's something that affects her life every day, but it's not something that needs to be constantly written down. It just felt like it was in the background, which I thought was handled really well. And her relationships with these men, again, were not idealistic. She thought some of them were going to go well, and then they end up not going well. Lots of them treat her really badly. And it just feels like a very funny but very true to life description of what it's like when you're in that difficult place and everything in your life seems to be falling apart. And yet it's very funny, and I feel like I was so behind her, really emotionally invested. It was well structured, well plotted, and I absolutely flew through it. Next we have another non-fiction, which is Losing Earth by Nathaniel Rich, and this was just a mind-blowing book, and it's a very scary book, and it's looking at the decade of the 70s and 80s when climate change was really first discovered to be a big issue. And it's looking at how close globally we came to being able to stop climate change and how we didn't do that. And we meet some of the different characters, some of the scientists who discovered what was happening with global warming. We meet some different lobbyists and people that were working for the various presidents of the US, and how it all came together. And it's a frustrating, terrifying read, especially when you know that all that we know about climate change now, we knew then. We knew like 40 years ago, and nothing's changed. We've known it the whole time, but we've all sat here doing nothing. And if anything, we've used more energy and produced more oil than we did beforehand. And it's a fascinating read to give you a primer on like the history of climate change and what it all means and what people discovered. And also interesting to see about human nature and how all of us are really programmed not to do anything if it doesn't affect us. Like, it's really hard for us to envisage, oh, this might affect our grandchildren, or this might affect our children, or even this might affect me. If you can't see the evidence of it in the atmosphere, people just don't get the urgency of it, all of us, and that's just a real human issue. It's a human condition, and it's really hard to make people act preemptively, especially in situations of this magnitude where companies and governments would be losing money. So I would, if you can stomach it, which I think we all need to, I would really recommend this. Number 8 is Zami, A New Spelling of My Name by Audrey Lord, which is an autobiography documenting her time growing up from childhood into kind of early adulthood, really, in New York during the sort of 50s and 60s. And it's a fascinating look at her life. It's so beautifully, so poetically written. I felt like I had to really slow down as I was reading it, because her sentences just had so much like power built into them. But it's a really beautiful read, and it's looking at her coming into her own, realising that she's gay, and how she dealt with that, especially being black as well, within New York during that time. And I haven't read many of her essays yet, which I absolutely will now after reading this, but I know a lot of them touch on the idea of intersectionality, which she talks about in this book as well, because she felt like being black, she wasn't really involved in the more like lesbian community with all the white girls, and equally sort of being a lesbian, she wasn't kind of seen as part of the black community as well. And I actually think this is quite a good introduction to her as a writer in general, because some of her essays that I've read already I found a little bit more heavy going, and because this is sort of an autobiography, it really got me into her style and made me kind of understand her as a person and her life. So I think this is a great introduction to her. Number 9 on this list is Lowborn by Kerry Hudson, which is another autobiography / non-fiction, which is looking back at Kerry Hudson's life growing up extremely poor in the UK, and she goes back to all of these different towns that she lived in, because she lived with her mother and sort of various other men, and they moved around a lot, council house to council house. She went to lots of different schools, so she's confronting that and going back to some of these really deprived areas, seeing what they're like now, talking to the people who live there now, and at the same time reliving some of her experiences there. And this is just a fantastic eye-opening read into what it's like to perpetually live in that state of poverty, to be so hungry all of the time, to have your life be so precarious, and to really need any job that you could possibly get, and be so dependent on it and on benefits. And she really shows you how difficult it is for someone to pull themselves out of that cycle. She had a very difficult relationship with her mother, who had a difficult relationship with her mother, who had a difficult relationship with her mother, and it's just a cycle of alcoholism or abuse or whatever, which was really difficult for her to break out of. And it means that a lot of her family ties are quite precarious now. And it really shines a light on that class imbalance now that she's moved across to the other side and has gained that different perspective. So I thought this was eye-opening, really interesting, and quite difficult at times, because Kerry Hudson is dealing with her own emotional trauma really at the same time as trying to tell you and explain what was going on in her life and explain what these places are like now. She's also trying to gear herself up to face her past. And finally on my list is a book which I don't think I actually included in my midway through the year, like my favourite books of the year so far, earlier in June, but it really stuck with me. And I can't really get it out of my head, and that's English Animals by Laura Kay. So I feel like this one has been a bit of a grower. It's about a young woman from Eastern Europe who comes to the UK to live with an English couple in the countryside to help them out around the house, and then she finds out to help them out with their taxidermy business, but also weddings that they throw in their cottage. But it's really about her developing a relationship with this couple. She develops a sexual relationship with the woman, and with the man she also has this sort of strange codependent relationship going on, where she's learning about his taxidermy project. And it's quite a quiet, unassuming read actually. You don't really realise how much she's saying with these characters and with this plot until sort of after you've read it, and she's really making a lot of comment on Englishness but also class, especially because these people are from quite a wealthy upper middle class background with their large house. And it touches on ideas of racism and xenophobia within Little England, as she's an Eastern European coming over to the English countryside, and also the general carelessness of the upper classes and not realising that what they do affects people and those around them, and just sort of wanting to have it all their own way. It's very interesting but also an enjoyable read, and I've read a lot of books this year and I feel like this has really stayed with me. I really remember it, like I can visualise that house that they were all in so vividly. So I think it was definitely a worthy contender to put on this top 10 list. So that's it, that's my top 10 best books that I've read in 2019. I hope you got some new recommendations. Some of these books I've talked about quite a lot, so they might not have been a surprise for you, but I really hope that I've given you some good ideas for what you can read in the new year if you haven't read them already. I would love to hear from you, as always, if you've read these books in the comments below. We can have a little chat, and also let me know what your favourite books that you read last year were. This is my favourite time of year to get recommendations from other people, either in the comments or by watching other people's booktube videos. I always end up buying way more books in January than I actually get for Christmas. So leave me a comment below, but if not, I will see you in my next video. Bye!